This is a video on the reaction to the Brown decision in 1954. Real quick, though, I wanted to go over the idea of why the NAACP, the Marigold, why they went after segregation in schools. Why did they attack schools? And one of the main reasons was the Marigold Report, which basically said if we blindly challenge constitutional validity of segregation, if and when accompanied by discrimination, we can strike directly at the most prolific sources of discrimination, the public schools. The NAACP started with Maryland in 1936, Murray versus Maryland. The Maryland Supreme Court confirmed an earlier ruling by a state court that Murray should be accepted into law school because there was no other equal school in the state and therefore must be accepted, and you can't tell him he has to go to another state. If he wants to go to this state school, you have to provide one or allow him into the white school. And then this was followed by the court cases we've talked about, Sweat versus Painter and the McLaren versus the Oklahoma State Board of Regents, and in each of these cases, the Supreme Court ruled with the NAACP that that segregation that equality must mean true equality, otherwise you have to integrate. So, why was Thurgood Marshall dubbed Mr. Civil Rights? Thurgood Marshall is the lawyer for the NAACP during the Brown cases. There was 5 of them that were put together by the Supreme Court. Working for the NAACP's Legal and Defense Education Fund, he chipped away at segregation, used equalization strategies. They worked in the South to equalize teacher salaries and school facilities, and basically they knew that if the South continued to have to equalize all of these different situations, that it would become too expensive. But also, by going into law schools, it was impossible to make those completely equal, so therefore they were allowed to start integrating. Basically, starting this process that segregation and separation is inherently unequal. So constant death threats and violence meant he needed around-the-clock bodyguards, and that he was putting his life at risk in his pursuit of equal rights. So here you have the Clark doll studies, where he is asking student here which doll he preferred, which doll he thought was better educated, and he had a series of questions that he would ask. Now, these doll studies were very controversial. However, they were a big piece of evidence used in the case. The case started in 1952, and it was argued further in 1954. Clarendon County, one of the plaintiffs' defendants, was equalized salaries and facilities for teachers and in South Carolina to continue to be able to use segregation. But the doll studies and some other evidence that was presented showed that segregation and separation were inherently unequal. In 1953, Eisenhower appointed Governor Earl Warren as Chief Justice. Earl Warren was on the record for saying, "One land, one law for everyone." So you would think that Eisenhower knew that if he put him in power, he might be dealing with this, with a case like Brown. He might be dealing with this type of highly controversial case in front of the elections of 1954. However, Eisenhower was more interested in getting rid of his one competition for the Republican Party and the lead of the Republican Party, his one competitor for the nomination of the party, even though he was president. And he knew that he had to get rid, that Earl Warren needed to be basically moved aside so that he had total control of the party, so he put him in the Supreme Court. Now, that was probably the most important because Eisenhower, despite Eisenhower trying to convince him otherwise, pushed for integration and was for a unanimous decision in favor of Brown, and basically the whole idea that separate is inherently unequal. So segregation schools ended by the court. And then you see this political cartoon, a Supreme Court bomb that was put in the Chicago Defender, basically, and the Defender comes out later and says that this was the more important to our democracy than the atom bomb. We will read some other newspaper editorials in class to see what the reaction is. Marshall predicted segregation would be finished by 1963. Many areas outside of the Deep South accepted the Brown decision. An initial white acceptance meant that 70% of school districts in border states integrated their classroom quickly and peacefully. And we can see in most of the editorials, people were coming out in favor of the Brown decision. But newspapers in Mississippi and some other places weren't quite as accepting. So here you see the state flag of Georgia that was created in 1954 in response to Brown, and you can see that the Confederate flag was added to it. Herman Talmadge was the governor, and we'll get to him in a second. First, Eisenhower, though, contended that Brown would set back progress in the South 15 years. And he basically was not for segregation. He wasn't against it, but he wasn't for it either. And because of the election of 1956 looming, he declared you cannot change people's hearts merely by laws, stated he would enforce the Constitution, but nothing more. And Georgia Governor Herman Talmadge went much further, refused the state's compliance with Brown, said that we will not follow what Brown has, changed the state flag to include the Confederate flag, and discussed how in 1832 Georgia and South Carolina and others defied the court. We can do it again. So, what was the state and federal government's reaction? South Carolina Governor James Byrne accused the court of playing into communist hands and used this idea of communism and the Red Scare to say why race mixing should not be happening. Mississippi Judge Tom Brady compared blacks to chimpanzees and stated that we have, through our forefathers, died for sacred principles. We can die again. And with others, U.S. Senator Harry Byrd and a newspaper editor, James Kilpatrick of Virginia, called for massive resistance against Brown, told the South that they need to unite and work against Brown. The Southern Manifesto, massive resistance, and the fight to preserve segregation. So, the Declaration of Constitutional Principles was a document that was put together by 101 Southern members of Congress and then signed, and it's known as the Southern Manifesto. The manifesto attacked Brown as an abuse of judicial power that trespassed upon states' rights. Now, they don't really have a lot of legal standing here, as states' rights didn't work out in the Civil War and aren't considered necessarily by the Constitution in this case. But Southern state legislatures declared Brown null and void. Across the South, in response to this idea of massive retaliation or massive resistance, you get across South laws, resolutions cut off aid to desegregated schools, canceled license of teachers in mixed classrooms, repealed compulsory attendance laws, empowered governors to close schools, and gave waivers for white students to go to all private schools, and other different laws that would make it really hard for people to segregate in the Deep South. So white citizen councils. White citizen councils were named by Marshall as uptown clans. The first one was formed in Mississippi in 1954, and they were the ones that took 53 farmers who had signed a petition by the NAACP to say that our schools need to be desegregated, our local schools need to be desegregated, and that was for the district court to decide. By signing this petition, they were kind of pushing towards that process. But when the White Council found out about them, they published the petition, they published the 53 black farmers' names, and this led to them losing their jobs, denied credit for seeds and machinery, and were basically forced to back down. Unless they backed down, they would lose their livelihood. Economic reprisals against white who supported integration, against companies like Philip Morris and Ford Motor Company because they spoke out in favor of integration. And so basically this was organizing economic pressure on blacks, boycotting pressure on companies, and just really pushing forward for this idea that integration shouldn't happen. Again, here is another picture of massive resistance as they gathered at a state courthouse to basically say this should not happen. You can see race mixing is communism. I'm not sure how that really fits, but that's what was being pushed forward. Created school choice. Black families who opted for white schools lost their jobs and were evicted from their homes. And Prince Edward County continued shut down public schools for 4 years. Politicians went after the NAACP because of their role with Brown. State legislatures required the NAACP to relinquish their membership lists or face large fines. And when those membership lists were relinquished, there was pressure put on those people. State agencies spied on the NAACP, falsely imprisoned members for race mixers, fixed juries against the NAACP, and manipulated the media against them. This harassment cost the NAACP 246 branches throughout the South and 48,000 members. And one of the biggest reasons why they were able to slow down this so much was because of the violence that was put against the South. Reincarnated the Ku Klux Klan and gained 50,000 new members. 7 gruesome murders in Mississippi in 1955, violence against blacks who refused to give into economic pressure. And so we're going to go over a couple of these examples. Reverend George Lee basically was driving home. He was working for voters' rights, was constantly helping people sign up for voting rolls. He worked with another guy to create the NAACP in Mississippi, and he was attacked in May 7th, 1955. A convertible pulled alongside Lee's car and shot 3 rounds of buckshot from a shotgun into Lee. Later, the sheriff called it a traffic accident, and that the shotgun pellets that were pulled out of Lee's body were dental fillings, according to the sheriff in his report, because he just said it was a traffic accident because he didn't want to have to investigate it. Gus Kortz, who was a partner of Reverend George Lee and an NAACP organizer, kept his name on the voting rolls and was gunned down. He later, he was a storekeeper, so the economic pressure didn't quite work on him, but eventually, because of the injuries, because of the idea that things were not working well for him, the shooting and because it came shortly after the trial that acquitted men who killed a teenager who was visiting from the north by the name of Emmett Till. And we will go over him later. So later, Court and his wife left Mississippi and started a business in Chicago. Lamar Smith was a 63-year-old farmer who was standing out on the courthouse. He was helping people register to vote and how to vote absentee ballots so they wouldn't have to show up at the voting rolls, and was shot down on the lawn of the courthouse in front of 30 witnesses. And the people that shot him were allowed to walk away, even though Sheriff Robert E. Case was standing there watching the process. Basically, Lamar Smith was killed by those assailants, and they were later arrested and acquitted because no one would come forward, even though there were 30 witnesses on the courthouse, in the lawn of the courthouse, that saw the killing. And so this was the type of violence that they were facing. And this is the type of massive resistance that the South was putting forward. And so we will have to go, so how did the civil rights movement move past this massive resistance and be able to enforce Brown? And we will do that as we move forward here.